Okay, this is the first lecture in regional planning to do with transport. So we've got 3 weeks together to look at Hobart if you're an on-campus student or a region of your choice if you don't have access to Hobart. So a bit about me. My PhD was from Macquarie University and it was to do with environmental management of a bushland area north of Sydney. Since my ecology days, I've moved sideways into transport planning and for the past 5 years worked as an advisor in transport planning for a non-government organisation. And as a reflection of this external experience, my teaching at UTAS has also changed to be much more planning focused with a particular focus on active transport, that is getting around assessment. I teach ecosystem conservation, statutory land use planning, and a breadth unit that's taught in second semester called Developing Your Creative and Entrepreneurial Potential. That keeps me pretty busy. I'm part-time, so I'm teaching intensive. I don't have a lot of extra time for supervising research, but do come and talk to me if you're interested in transport planning, especially anything to do with sustainable transport or walking and cycling in particular. And that's the link where you can find a few more details about me. Doing over the 3 Milo postings to show me that you've achieved your learning in region. You will probably refer to historical material, but it might depend on the topic that you're doing. So talk strategic plan, particularly anything that mentions sustainable transport or integrated transport. The third part is reflecting on region. Does your on-ground experience match what's in material for your area? And the final posting will include some advice that you have for your local area. You might be actually submitting this in the case of Hobart, or you might just be posting it in the case of other regions. Again, if you're not sure, talk to me. 1,000 words in total for your Milo discuss postings each week. Use illustrations, tables, photo, and that will help me judge the quality of your postings. Everybody does need to do some sort of a trip. If you're on campus or a distant student, if you're not in Hobart, you will need to spend a little bit of time on just do this, relying on your own experience. You might need to do a bit of digging around car parking policies for your region and investigating, where the parking is and how easy it is, how much it costs. Car parking is really critical in terms of transport planning. So you need to spend a bit of time investigating that. And I do want you to cross-reference what you found or what you've experienced in your region with is there anything about integrated transport, what stepped up to what the challenges are, or are they yet to address that? And so the final posting is going to have some advice for your area, for your council. Okay, so this is the terms of what you'll need to know to do the assessment. This week I'll cover transport features, what is integrated transport, what is a mode share and what multimodal transport might look like. I'll also introduce you to sustainable transport and the principles that underline this might look like, because you'll need some of this before you do the field trip. And then finally, have a look at the sort of data that underpins transport planning, or at least should underpin transport planning, but often isn't collected. Who are the main actors and stakeholders in transport planning? You might want to work in this area, so I'll have talk about a little bit about the kind of graduate employment opportunities that there are. And even if you don't plan on working in transport planning, how you can have your say and how you can be effective. You have seen a version of this content before in the earlier weeks on regional planning theory. So in terms of transport, The practice is much like many other sectors of planning. Councils and the state government are committees. I'm on one of the Hobart City Council committees around transport planning, and like any other aspect of planning, there's a public comment period for strategies and plans where you can have your say, and there's also, if there's a formal application for development to council, you can have your say. Dialogue across different stakeholders. Obviously, the government enterprises that are Tasmania, particularly with respect to land development, and they don't have a huge voice. However, Heart Foundation has done some really good work on that background structure of good regional planning, good suburb planning. The current state of play in Tasmania is that government departments are not very well coordinated in terms of transport planning, and it depends because some councils, Hobart probably has stronger relationships. Growth was cut a lot when the Hodgman government came in as part of their promises around reducing the size of government, and that made a big difference in terms of their ability to actually deliver planning. Okay, so this is what's going to happen over the next 3 weeks. I'm going to talk about transport features, integrated transport modes. Before we go on the field trip, you'll also need to review the material about sustainable transport planning, the principles that underlie sustainable transport planning, what a good, air quotes, either with me in Hobart or in your own region, you have an eye out for the kind of things that you need to discuss online. And then the final week, much of this material is based on a chapter by Mies about transport planning, and it's in the regional planning book. I'll make that available in Milo. Transport really created cities, as Mies argues very early on in that chapter. So beginning with water transport, which favours locations close to harbours and rivers, transport really drove development, shape and the structure of cities. It meant that suburbs could spread over a much greater. Then cars came along and really opened things up again. And so no matter what area you look at, you'll see this common pattern from expansion from the ports, then along some sort of public transport line like the tram network in Hobart, and then a real opening up of the areas around that centre and around those linear corridors because of the freedom. Dominated route didn't have long-term planning, didn't, I guess, necessarily foresee that investment in cars as the primary means of transport might come back to bite them down the track. Mies talks about cities like Copenhagen, which is represented by the image here, Munich and Zurich, who adopted much more balanced transport plans in the 1960s than many places, certainly in Australia and North America. Essentially, this came about through substantial deliberate investment in public transport. So as well as catering for an increasing number of motorists, because think of somewhere like Copenhagen as being paradise for people who want to get around without a car, there's still a lot of car use in these places. It's just that the mode share around public transport, around biking, around walking is much, much higher than other places. And this has been quite deliberately planned. So historically, most places did have much more of a balance. This is an image from somebody that I follow on Instagram who is one of the main transport planners in Copenhagen. Really beautiful old photograph of a mixture of transport in Copenhagen. Somebody could probably date the picture by the transport modes here, particularly the old car. But you can see the mix here of trams, cars, people on foot, and lots of people on bikes. And obviously the transport is all going slow enough that there's easy mixing of the different modes. So ironically enough, even though this might be seen as old-fashioned, a lot of places that are trying to shift towards a more sustainable transport environment are looking for this kind of low-speed shared zone as a means of changing from a car-dominated environment. This is really difficult, as Barry Hutton argues in his book, Planning Sustainable Transport. Anything that's that's seen as being anti-car or taking away from the freedom that cars are associated with now is a real political tripwire. And this is why it's been so difficult to shift from a car-dominated city for most places. This is Hobart around 1930, a kind of similar view, I guess, to what you saw in Copenhagen, which is probably taken around the same time. There were the trams that no longer exist in Hobart. Traffic tended to move fairly slowly. There weren't many cars. There were a lot of people on foot, a lot of people using bikes. The port was a very active place, as it is now, but a different kind of mix of uses in the port. So ironically enough, the current transport planning activity that's going on by the City of Hobart is looking to shift back to this earlier mode share, or more of a mix of a mode share than what we've got at the moment, because we've got to the point where car and congestion is becoming problematic, and cars are starting to mean that transport is becoming less reliable and trips are taking longer. So this is the point where cars are seen to be breaking cities, is the way a lot of people have been putting it. But getting back from that situation is really difficult. People don't like having their freedoms curtailed, even though having that freedom might mean sitting in traffic. So a version of this diagram will appear in a lot of transport planning documents, particularly anything around sustainable transport planning. So this particular image is from Mies on page 635. So increased car ownership and car use has all these knock-on effects around healthy transport. So you see increased car use means a decline in walking, whether that's to the bus or to some other transport mode. And this is why the Heart Foundation has weighed in quite heavily around transport planning, because of the adverse health impacts. It means that changes in growth of retail centres, more retail areas outside the city that people can access by their car, lots of free public transport, huge big car parks around big box stores on the outskirts of cities. That has consequences in terms of the viability of existing retail centres. More demands for road-to-road parking. Roads are very expensive. This, of course, also has consequences in terms of the environment, pollution. It has road safety consequences. So the current road toll in Tasmania every year is about 340, 350 people. And this is a really unfortunate side effect of our car-dominated culture. And unfortunately, that toll has become socially normal. So it's very difficult to do anything about it now. Congestion, I've mentioned. This has adverse economic impacts. And just generally giving over space to cars means that we're choosing a certain kind of urban quality, urban space. When you allocate urban space to either moving traffic or storing private vehicles, like on streets for car parking, then you miss opportunities to make that space work differently. So there's a whole lot of ideas in this figure, and you'll see versions of this figure in basically any text on sustainable transport planning. So Hobart and Tasmania is very typical of most transport planning in that it's very much dominated by engineers. It's become a very technical kind of discipline, and this is in concert with that comprehensive planning approach that you heard about in the first unit, where Michael talked about the different kind of planning approach. This is very much a data heavy, model heavy, technical heavy kind of discipline, where transport engineers and traffic engineers are generally the ones calling the shots. This makes things really difficult in terms of participatory planning, because you need to know a fair bit before you can feel like you're having much input. So much of traffic engineering goes back to standards set by Austroads. Austroads manuals are very technical about speeds and widths for various kind of components on the road, and it's not for the faint-hearted in terms of diving into some of that detail. So, which is not to say that we shouldn't have our say on what we think our regions should look like and how they should work for us. So it can be intimidating in terms of getting involved in transport planning, but everybody has a valid voice, even if you don't have that kind of engineering or architectural background that lets you have input on that same kind of technical platform. So in terms of what I want you to do this week, I want you to describe the transport features of your region. So have a look at who are the regional organisations that look after transport planning. Is there more than one level of government that has something to say about transport planning in your area? What are your region's transport features? So what does your place look like? Where do people live? Where do people work? How do they get there? What's the current mode share? What can you find about current transport plans that are in place for your area? For those doing Hobart, we're going to need to subdivide this topic a little bit. Otherwise, it'll be a race to see who can post first. So you've got a choice. You can either pick a mode, say look at bikes as a means of getting around Hobart, what planning is there, what's already been built, what's been planned but not built, what's just not spoken about in terms of plans just missing. You could pick an area, say you live in Kingston, you might like to talk about the transport from Kingston. What are the attractors? Where are people going to? Where do people live? What choices have they got? Mention the different modes if you're taking this area approach. So talk about active transport, public transport and private car transport. Or you could ignore the people side of transport and look at freight instead if you like. So this needs to be posted to the Milo discussion board. The second online exercise is moving beyond this description and looking at the sustainable transport goals for your region. So what is there specifically about sustainable transport for your area? How might people get around? So what kind of options does somebody who has, say, lives in the outer areas, do they have options other than a car? How does this depend on where they live? What can you tell me from the theory that you're reading? And there'll be set readings for this week. And how does that apply to your region? So I am expecting this to be more than just a description based on your observations and your cruising around the internet. If you want to score well, then you're going to need to show me that you're able to link material back to theory. If it's not to the readings that I post, then to material that you find yourself. And again, there's a deadline around posting to the Milo discussion board. The third online exercise might be that you actually pull together a submission to the Hobart City Council about their private transport consultation. So that's going on at the moment. And if you are going to do that, post your response to the Milo discussion board. So it can be including, the formal salutations to council. You don't need to adapt it, just post to Milo what you're going to send Hobart City Council. If you're not making a submission or you're doing a region other than Hobart, then use these prompts for your third online exercise. So make some comment about how land use planning controls like zoning affect your region's ability to develop sustainable and people-centred transport systems. What can you find in terms of land use planning controls that says something about this? This might not be easy to find, but do have a look in the academic literature to see whether there's already been comment that does that hard work for you in terms of going back to the legislation and what it says. What do you think the prospects are for your region in terms of integrated transport? So what is either already there in planning but not there yet, or just not spoken about yet? So what might be actually missing from plans? And thinking about the advice that you might give your local council, whether it's Hobart or a different council, what do you think are the most important actions over the short, medium and long term that would make the transport system more efficient and more sustainable? So this all needs to be posted by that third deadline. So in terms of describing your transport features, here's how you might go about it. So I'm going to have a quick look at Sydney. So this is a shot of Circular Quay. This might be very familiar to some of you, and it shows what an important transport hub Circular Quay is, that you can get ferries and trains to this area, that there's reasonable biking and walking, and it's also a hub for tourism and commercial ships that come in. So Sydney is a bit challenging in terms of transport because of the harbour. So this creates bottlenecks around many of the key transport routes. So not just Sydney Harbour Bridge, but other places in the harbour. If you're trying to get to a central location or you're trying to travel across town, you tend to be funneled over bridges and other squeeze points. And it also limits the public transport network. So this image here shows the percentage of public transport in journeys to work, and you can see that most parts of inner Sydney are pretty well serviced. Some of these white gaps are where people don't live, so on the headland near Manly, but some of them reflect the fact that the trains just don't service these areas. So here's the next slide that shows the percentage of people who take the train to work in the morning, and you can see that there's quite large areas of inner Sydney that aren't serviced by trains. So it can be pretty difficult from some of these locations, particularly if you're not going into town but you're going across town. So I used to live at Bondi Beach and have to travel through Chatswood to get to Macquarie Park. This was before the train line went in. And basically I had to use a car. I did sometimes catch a bus, but it was a really long bus trip with a change in the middle of town. And if I was going to do that every day, basically 4 hours of my day was spent on public transport. So I either had to work from home or had to figure out how to be productive on the bus because it took up a huge part of my day. Or I left early, I took the car and I was there pretty quickly. So Sydney has been a train city for quite a long time. So by the 1920s, Sydney already had a pretty good public transport system, care of trams and trains. The first rail services started in 1855, 67 years after the founding of Sydney, and the tram network began in 1861. So by the 1920s, it was already pretty large, and it meant that this rail infrastructure allowed people to live in the suburbs but work more centrally. So working class suburbs developed even quite a long way out of Sydney as early as the 1920s. So this kind of history underlies what you see in Sydney now. So in thinking about your region, you might need to delve back into what happened to understand the spatial distribution of suburbs and the pattern of transport that you see currently. In terms of mode share, this is another image from the ME's chapter, and it shows how much things have changed over a period of time between 1951 and 2006, and how the transport mode of workers, this is in Melbourne rather than Sydney, has changed from, some of these numbers have really massively changed. The total public transport has dropped from around 57% of workers to only 14%. Car use has jumped from 16% up to 78%. The non-motorised modes have dropped from 24% down to 5%. And in many parts of Melbourne, even 5% is a lot. It's more like 1 or 2%. So in thinking about your region, have a look to see what you can find about the historical mode share at various points of time. It doesn't have to be a particular time, but just in decades past, and see what you can find out about the mode share now or in kind of recent past. 2006 isn't very recent, but still the comparison and the change over this time is really interesting. So have a go at describing your region in the next lecture, which you will need to listen to before we go out for our field trip or before you go out for a trip around your region, is around sustainable transport planning and the principles that underlie sustainable transport planning, what a good strategic transport plan might look like, so that you can critique what's available for your region. And then the final lecture before the final posting, we'll be looking at data, actors, stakeholder, and how people are involved. In terms of the field trip, I'll just say this now as well as repeating it before the end of the second lecture. So this is really looking about how to change the mode share from what is probably a car dominant city, although your region might not be, it might be a bit different, to looking to see how to get more of a balanced design that we looked at earlier with respect to Munich, Zurich and Copenhagen. So what might need to be deliberately planned and what might need to change in terms of infrastructure and incentives to open up options around transport, particularly for people who don't live in the inner city, who don't have access to the resources that mean that they've got options. What needs to change? On-campus students will need to at least flick through the consultation document. That's the City of Hobart Transport Strategy. It's still being developed. It's still in draft mode. It's long, but have a look through and familiarise yourself with that before we go and talk to the author of the strategy as part of our field trip. And distance students, have a look for your regional transport strategy. So this might be looking on your council's website, or you might need to go at a higher level and some sort of council amalgamation, some sort of regional body, or potentially even the state government, but you're probably looking at a lower level than that. And finally, in terms of references, here's the MEs chapter that I've drawn on pretty heavily for this particular lecture from Planning Australia and a couple of others.